20 minutes before her sister's wedding, Sophia Calloway was kneeling on a bathroom floor holding back Elena's hair while she threw up for the third time. Nobody outside this room knew that. Outside, 300 guests were already seated in the Calloway Gardens, vampires and humans mixed together in careful rows, all of them waiting to watch Elena marry a man none of them had actually met. The King of the Eastern Court, Roman Astor, a name that made grown men lower their voices when they said it. "I can't," Elena gasped, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, smearing the careful makeup the stylist had spent 2 hours on. "Sophia, I can't do this. I can't marry him. You're just nervous." Sophia said it the way she'd said it 100 times that morning, even though she didn't believe it anymore. Everybody's nervous on their wedding day. Everybody's not marrying a vampire they've never even spoken to. Elena's eyes were wild, rimmed red, her wedding dress already wrinkled at the knees from kneeling. "Dad sold me. Sophia. He sold me for a trade route and a loan he can't pay back. And I'm supposed to just smile and let some 300-year-old man put a ring on my finger like I'm she stopped." Pressed her hand over her mouth like she might be sick again. Sophia rubbed slow circles on her sister's back, the same way their mother used to do before she died, the same way Sophia had been doing for Ilana since they were 6 years old and Ilana had nightmares she wouldn't admit to anyone but her twin. It was always like this. Ilana fell apart, and Sophia held the pieces together. Nobody had ever asked Sophia if she minded. "Look at me," Sophia said. Ilana did. Same face. Same green eyes. Same dark hair. Same small scar above the left eyebrow from when they were 8 and fell off the stable fence together. Identical down to the bone, except for the small things only the two of them knew. Elena's laugh came out louder. Sophia's hands shook when she was scared, and Elena's didn't. Right now, Elena's hands were shaking too. Sophia had been the one born second, by 11 minutes, and somehow those 11 minutes had decided everything that came after. Elena got the bigger bedroom because she was older. Elena got introduced first at parties. When their mother died, giving them a baby brother who didn't survive the week either, it was Elena their father pulled close, and Sophia who learned to stand quietly at the edge of rooms, waiting to be useful instead of wanted. Nobody had ever explained why. It had just always been that way. The way weather was always that way. Something you stopped questioning and started planning around. "It's 2 years," Sophia said. "That's what the contract says. 2 years and then the loan's paid off, and Dad's reputation is fixed, and you can 2 years married to a vampire. I'll be too scared to sleep in the same house as." Ilana grabbed Sophia's wrists, hard enough to hurt. "You don't understand. You don't have to do this." "I do." There was a knock at the door, their father's voice, clipped and impatient the way it always was when something might embarrass him in front of important people. "Elena, 5 minutes." Elena's face went the color of old paper. "I'm going to be sick again," she whispered, and for a second Sophia believed it was just nerves, the kind that would pass once Elena was standing at the altar, and it was too late to run. Then Elena said the thing that changed everything. "Switch with me." Sophia actually laughed, a short disbelieving sound. "What?" "You heard me." Elena was already moving, already reaching for the hem of her dress like she meant to pull it off right there on the bathroom tile. Nobody's ever been able to tell us apart. Not Dad, not the staff, not anyone except us. You stand in for the ceremony, just the ceremony. I'll figure out the rest after. I'll talk to him myself once I'm not about to throw up every 10 seconds. Sophia, I cannot walk down that aisle right now. I physically cannot do it. Elena, that's insane. That's not. People will know. He'll know. You can't just switch places with someone at your own wedding like it's a school play. He's never seen either of our faces. Not once. The whole arrangement went through lawyers and Dad. He doesn't know what either of us looks like beyond a photograph from 3 years ago, and we looked even more alike back then. Elena grabbed both of Sophia's hands now, and her grip was different than before, pleading instead of panicked. Please, you've spent our whole lives covering for me. One more time, please, Sophia, I'm begging you. Sophia looked at her sister's face, the one that was the mirror of her own, and felt the old familiar weight settle onto her shoulders, the one that had been there since they were children and their father had decided, without ever saying it out loud, which daughter mattered more. If I do this, Sophia said slowly, and he finds out during the ceremony, he won't. You don't know that. Sophia. Another knock at the door, sharper this time. Their father again. Elena's eyes were full and desperate, and so much like their mother's that Sophia's chest hurt looking at them. I have never asked you for anything like this before. That wasn't entirely true. But it was true enough, in the way that mattered, and there wasn't time left to argue about it. Sophia closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she was already reaching for the buttons on the back of Elena's dress. We're insane, she said. Probably, Elena agreed, already pulling Sophia's plain blue bridesmaid dress over her head in exchange. Hurry, 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 hurry. 4 minutes later, the door opened, and the bride who walked out into the hallway was not the one who had walked in. The wedding dress didn't fit Sophia the way it fit Ilana. Not really. They were the same height, same build, close enough that nobody glancing across a garden would notice the difference, but Sophia could feel where the bodice had been taken in, around Ilana's narrower waist, a half-inch of fabric pinching at her ribs with every breath. She told herself it didn't matter. In 20 minutes it would be over, and Elena could explain everything to the king herself, in private, away from 300 watching eyes. That was the plan. Anyway, Sophia had stopped believing in plans a long time ago, but she walked toward the garden doors, like she still did. Her father was waiting in the hallway, straightening his cufflinks, not even looking at her properly. You're late, he said. Don't embarrass us today, Elena. This marriage is the only thing standing between this family and ruin. Do you understand me? Smile. Look grateful. Sophia almost laughed. He'd called her Elena her entire life by accident, more times than she could count, but never once had he mistaken Elena for her. It only ever went one direction. She was good at being mistaken for someone else. She'd had practice. I understand, Sophia said, because that's what Elena would say, and because it was easier than correcting him. Edmund Calloway offered his arm and walked his daughter toward the garden without once looking at her face. Sophia thought about saying something, telling him, right there in the hallway, that this was a mistake, that she was the wrong daughter, that he should go find Elena before it was too late to fix any of this quietly. The words sat in her throat for a second. Then, she pictured her father's face if she said them out loud in front of the staff and the caterers and the vampire envoy who'd already arrived to oversee the ceremony, and she swallowed the words back down instead. Some habits were older than courage. The garden had been transformed overnight into something out of a painting, white flowers strung between the old oak trees, candles burning in glass jars even though it was the middle of the afternoon, because vampires apparently liked the look of flame regardless of whether they needed the light. Rows of chairs filled with faces Sophia half recognized from a lifetime of standing 2 steps behind her sister at parties like this one. Lords and ladies from the human court, pale, still figures scattered among them who didn't fidget the way the humans did, who didn't seem to need to blink as often. And at the end of the aisle, standing very straight in black, was the man Sophia was about to marry pretending to be someone else. She'd seen exactly one photograph of Roman Astor before today, a formal portrait commissioned for the marriage contract, and it hadn't prepared her for this. In the photograph he'd looked carved, distant, like something built rather than born. In person he looked like that too, except worse, because in person you could feel it, the stillness coming off him in waves, the way the air around him seemed to hold its breath. Sophia's own breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. This is Alina's mistake to fix, she reminded herself. I'm just standing in the gap until she's ready. The music started. Some old formal piece played on instruments Sophia didn't recognize, slow and deliberate, giving her exactly enough time to walk the length of the aisle and exactly enough time to panic with every step. She kept her eyes down the way a nervous bride would, kept her chin slightly lowered. Elena's perfume, sharp and floral, clung to the dress and rose up to meet her with every step, a smell that didn't belong to Sophia, on a day that didn't belong to her either. Halfway down the aisle, she made the mistake of looking up. Roman Astor was watching her walk toward him with an expression she couldn't read at all. Not warmth. Not coldness either exactly. Something more careful than both, like a man doing math in his head and not yet sure of the answer. His eyes were a strange pale gray, almost silver in the candlelight, and they tracked her the entire way down the aisle without once blinking that Sophia could see. She thought, absurdly, of the way her father's prize horses used to watch strangers approach the stable, assessing, deciding whether to bolt. By the time she reached him, her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. "You're trembling," he said. Quiet, just for her. His voice was low and even, with an accent she couldn't quite place, something old underneath the modern words. "It's a big day," Sophia managed. Something flickered across his face. Gone before she could name it. The officiant began speaking, the standard words about union and contract and the binding of two houses. Words that meant nothing to Sophia except that they were running out, that the ceremony was moving forward whether she was ready or not, that somewhere behind the crowd Alina was presumably watching from a window, waiting for the moment she could step back into her own life. Sophia didn't see her sister anywhere. She didn't have time to look. Roman Astor had reached for her hand to slide the ring onto her finger, and the moment his skin touched hers, something in his expression changed completely. His fingers stilled around hers. His eyes, those strange pale eyes, moved slowly from her hand up to her face, studying her the way he might study a forged document held up to the light, searching for the place where the ink didn't quite match. "Wait," he said softly, so quietly that only she could hear it over the officiant's droning voice. "You're not her. Wait, you're not her." Sophia's heart stopped, then slammed forward twice as fast to make up for it. For a second, she genuinely considered running, right there in front of 300 guests, ring half on her finger, veil still down. She could feel her pulse in her throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "Don't." His grip on her hand tightened, not painfully, but enough that she understood it wasn't a request. "Your scent is different. Your pulse is different. Even your hands are shaped slightly differently than the woman whose photograph I was sent 3 years ago. I've had 300 years to learn the difference between a nervous bride and a liar. And you, whoever you are lying to a garden full of my political rivals." The officiant had paused, sensing something off in the silence, glancing between them with the polite confusion of a man unsure whether he'd missed his cue. Behind them, Sophia could hear the faint rustle of 300 people starting to notice that something had stalled. Roman's eyes didn't leave her face. Sophia waited for him to say it, to turn to the crowd and announce that the bride standing in front of him was a fraud, that the Calloway family had tried to deceive the Eastern Court on its own wedding day, that this whole arrangement was finished before it had started. He didn't. Instead, his thumb moved once, slowly, over the back of her hand, almost thoughtful, like he was buying himself a few more seconds to think. "Continue," he said quietly to the officiant. The man blinked. "Your Majesty?" "I said continue." Roman's voice had gone flat and final, the kind of voice that didn't get questioned twice. He turned his face back to Sophia, and there was something in his expression now that hadn't been there a moment before. Something sharper, more deliberate. We'll finish this conversation later. Smile. Sophia didn't know what else to do, so she smiled. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur she would barely remember afterward. The officiant's voice reciting words about loyalty and protection and the binding of two houses under treaty law. The ring, cold metal, sliding the rest of the way onto her finger. Her own voice saying I do in a tone that sounded steadier than she felt, because some old instinct from a childhood of standing in for Elena at piano recitals and writing lessons knew how to perform calm even while everything underneath was falling apart. Roman said his own vows without hesitation, his voice carrying easily across the garden, warm enough for the crowd, cold enough underneath that only Sophia, standing this close, could feel it. When the officiant finally said the words that made it official, a ripple of applause went through the garden. Somewhere in the crowd, a string quartet started playing again. Sophia caught a glimpse of her father's face, beaming with the particular relief of a man who'd just watched his debts disappear, and somewhere beyond him, near the edge of the garden behind a row of white roses, she caught 1/2 second of a face that was the mirror of her own, pale and wide-eyed, watching from where she shouldn't have been standing at all. Elena. Sophia looked away fast, before anyone could follow her gaze. Roman offered his arm. She took it because there wasn't another option, and together they walked back up the aisle as husband and wife, while 300 guests stood and clapped for a marriage that was, depending on how you counted it, either completely real or not real at all. "You're very good at that," Roman murmured, low enough that only she could hear, his face arranged into something that almost looked like a smile for the benefit of the watching crowd. The performance, almost convincing. "I had practice," Sophia said before she could stop herself. His eyes cut sideways to her, something flickering there again, quick and unreadable. "I imagine you did." They reached the end of the aisle, where the receiving line waited, where 100 more strangers wanted to shake her hand and offer congratulations she hadn't earned for a wedding that wasn't supposed to be hers. Roman kept her arm tucked firmly against his side the entire time, never letting more than a few inches of space open between them, and Sophia understood, somewhere underneath the panic, that this wasn't affection. It was containment. He was keeping her close because he hadn't decided yet what to do with her, and an unpredictable variable was safer held tight than left to wander. By the time the receiving line ended, her face hurt from smiling, and her hand ached from being shaken by people whose names she'd never learn. Somewhere in that blur of strangers, a vampire lord with silver hair had studied her a beat too long before offering his congratulations, and an older human woman in emerald silk had whispered to her companion just loud enough for Sophia to catch the word lucky, like she'd won something instead of inherited a problem that wasn't hers to begin with. Sophia kept nodding, kept smiling, kept her hand steady inside Roman's grip even though her whole body wanted to shake. The reception was already underway behind them. Music and laughter and the clink of glasses. 300 people celebrating a lie none of them knew they were celebrating. Roman leaned down slightly, his mouth close to her ear, his voice no warmer than it had been at the altar. "My study. Now, before anyone else notices what I already know." It wasn't a request either. The study was quiet in a way that made Sophia's ears ring after the noise of the reception. Dark wood shelves climbed 2 stories to a ceiling she couldn't see the top of without tilting her head back, and the only light came from a fireplace already burning despite the warm afternoon outside. Roman shut the door behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam. "Sit," he said. She didn't. "I'd rather stand." Something almost like approval crossed his face. There and gone. He didn't sit either. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, arms crossed, studying her the way he had at the altar, like he was still doing math and the numbers still weren't adding up the way he wanted them to. "Name," he said. Sophia. Sophia Calloway. Yes, and the woman whose name was on the contract I signed 11 months ago. Elena Calloway. Your sister. It wasn't really a question, so Sophia didn't bother answering it like one. She nodded. Twins, Roman said, more to himself than to her, working something out. That explains the scent confusion. Close enough in blood relation to be nearly identical, distinct enough underneath it for someone who's been alive long enough to learn the difference. He looked at her properly then, fully, in a way that made Sophia want to fold her arms over herself even though she was wearing a wedding gown, not anything revealing. Where is she? I don't know. Don't lie to me twice in one afternoon. It's a bad habit to start a marriage with. I genuinely don't know, Sophia said, and some old stubbornness she usually kept buried rose up in her voice without permission. She panicked an hour before the ceremony. Couldn't stop being sick. Begged me to take her place for the ceremony itself. Just the ceremony. And said she'd explain everything to you herself once she calmed down. I haven't seen her since the vows. I assume she's somewhere on the property, but I don't know where, and frankly, neither do you, which makes us even on that front. Roman's eyebrows rose slightly. Whatever reaction he'd expected, it apparently wasn't that one. You're angry, he observed. I'm exhausted, Sophia said, and I just got married to a stranger in my sister's place because she asked me to, and I'm bad at saying no to her, and now I'm standing in a study getting interrogated by a man who could probably kill me without trying very hard. So forgive me if my tone isn't what you expected from a Calloway daughter today. For a long moment, Roman just looked at her. The fire popped behind him, sending a brief flare of orange light across his face, and Sophia thought, absurdly, that he looked tired too, underneath all that careful stillness. 300 years old, and he still looked tired the same way regular people did. She hadn't expected that. Whatever she'd pictured a vampire king looking like in his private moments, exhaustion hadn't been part of it. Why didn't I expose you? He said slowly, like he was answering a question she hadn't asked yet, during the ceremony, in front of 300 witnesses, the moment I realized. I don't know. I've been wondering that myself, because the moment I announced that the Calloway family attempted to deceive the Eastern Court on a treaty marriage, this alliance is finished. Not delayed, finished. And the debts your father owes my court, the ones this entire marriage was supposed to settle, come due immediately, in full, with interest accumulated over 3 years of deferment. He said it flatly, like reciting numbers from a ledger rather than describing a catastrophe. Your family loses everything. Possibly the estate itself. Possibly more than that, depending on how generous my counsel is feeling, which historically is not very. Sophia's stomach turned over. She hadn't known the specifics, only the vague shape of it, that her father owed money he couldn't repay, and this marriage was meant to fix it. And the alternative? She asked quietly. The alternative is that the marriage stands. Officially, publicly, the wife I married this afternoon remains my wife, and whatever happened in that garden stays a private matter between the two of us. His jaw tightened slightly. It is, admittedly, not the arrangement I agreed to 11 months ago. You don't even know me. I knew almost nothing about the woman I agreed to marry either way, Roman said. A photograph, a list of accomplishments written by lawyers trying to make her sound appealing. That's not knowing someone. That's reading a summary. He uncrossed his arms, pushed off from the fireplace, took 2 steps closer, close enough that Sophia had to tilt her head back slightly to keep meeting his eyes. So tell me, Sophia Calloway, since apparently you're the one I actually married, what am I supposed to do with you? Sophia held his gaze even though every instinct told her to look away. I don't know, she said honestly. But I'd like a say in the answer, since it's apparently my life too now. Something shifted in his expression, quick and surprised, almost like he hadn't expected her to say that, hadn't expected anyone in this situation to have an opinion that wasn't fear. "Most people," he said quietly, "don't talk to me like that. Most people probably aren't accidentally married to you by lunchtime," Sophia said. For one strange second, she thought he might actually laugh. He didn't. But something close to it moved behind his eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "Here's what's going to happen," Roman said, and the warmth, what little of it there had been, drained back out of his voice. He was a king again, not a tired man standing by a fire. "Tonight you'll travel back to the Eastern Court with me, as planned, as my wife, because that's what every guest at this wedding now believes happened. You'll have your own chambers, separate from mine. You'll attend the functions that require a queen to be present, and you'll say nothing, to anyone, about how this marriage actually began. And if I refuse, then I'll have no choice but to correct the record publicly, and your family loses everything I described a few minutes ago." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Just fact. Laid out flat. I'd rather not do that. It's messy, and I have enough messes already without manufacturing new ones over a wedding gone sideways. But I will, if you give me no other option. Sophia thought about her father, downstairs right now, probably accepting congratulations with a glass of champagne in his hand, certain his problems were solved. She thought about the staff who'd worked for the Calloway family for decades, who'd lose their positions if the estate collapsed. She thought, even though she didn't want to, about Elena, who'd asked for one favor and was probably hiding somewhere on the property right now, terrified, waiting to see whether her sister's sacrifice had worked. "Fine," Sophia said. "I'll do it. You don't sound thrilled." "I'm not thrilled. I'm doing math, same as you." She crossed her arms, mirroring the posture he'd had earlier, not entirely on purpose. There was a strange relief underneath the fear in finally being the one making a decision about her own life instead of standing quietly while everyone else made it for her. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. There wasn't time. 2 years. That's what the original contract said, wasn't it? 2 years and the debt's considered settled? Something flickered across his face. "You know the terms of the contract. I read it. Elena gave me the summary, but I asked to see the actual document, because apparently I'm the only one in this family who reads contracts before people sign them on my behalf." It came out sharper than she meant it to, more bitter, an old wound she hadn't realized was still open until it bled through right there in front of a stranger. She softened her tone, embarrassed. 2 years. Then what? Then the terms are fulfilled, and the marriage can be dissolved, if both parties wish it. Roman studied her for a long moment. "You don't have to do this, Sophia. I could still find your sister. Make the correction properly. You could go back to whatever life you had this morning." For one strange second, the offer almost sounded tempting. Sophia thought about her old life, the one where she stood 2 steps behind Elena at every party, where her father called her by the wrong name and never noticed, where she existed mostly as backup, as the spare, as the version of Elena that didn't matter as much. 2 years as someone's wife, even a stranger's, even under false pretenses, was still the first time in her life anyone had actually needed her to be herself instead of a substitute for someone else. "No," Sophia said. "I'll stay. I gave my word in that garden, even if the wrong sister gave it." Roman didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded once, like that settled something, and walked to his desk, pulling open a drawer. "You'll need this," he said, holding out a small velvet box. Sophia opened it to find a second ring, simpler than the wedding band already on her finger, plain dark metal without stones. "It marks you as court-bound. Protection, mostly. Anyone who might think a human bride is an easy target will think twice once they see it. Protection from what? My court has enemies, same as any court does." Rivals who'd be very interested to learn the King of the East married under questionable circumstances, and even more interested to learn his queen is human and unprotected. He closed her fingers around the box before she could refuse it, his hand cool against hers, brief and businesslike. Wear it. Please. Sophia slid the ring on next to the first one. It fit perfectly, which felt like one more thing in this entire day that had happened without her permission. A carriage was waiting by sundown. Sophia said goodbye to no one, because there was no one left to say goodbye to who knew the truth, and her father, 3 glasses of champagne deep into celebrating his rescued finances, hugged her tightly and told her she'd done well, never once suspecting which daughter he was praising. The ride to the Eastern Court took most of the night. Roman sat across from her in the dark carriage, mostly silent, occasionally glancing out the window at countryside Sophia had never seen before. She kept waiting for him to ask more questions, to demand the rest of the story. But he didn't, and somewhere around midnight, exhausted past the point of fear, Sophia fell asleep against the carriage window, with her sister's wedding dress still wrinkled around her knees. She woke once, briefly, to the sensation of something soft being draped over her shoulders. A coat. His coat. When she cracked her eyes open just enough to see, Roman had already turned back toward the window, watching the dark countryside slide by like he hadn't done anything at all. The Eastern Court castle looked like something carved out of a mountain, rather than built on top of one, dark stone walls climbing up into mist that never seemed to fully clear, even at midday. Sophia had expected something colder. Instead, when the carriage finally rolled to a stop in the courtyard near dawn, she found herself staring at ivy growing thick along one entire wing, windows glowing warm gold from inside, and a small fountain still running despite the early hour, water catching the first gray light. "It's beautiful," she said, before she could stop herself. Roman glanced at her, surprised again, the way he kept being surprised by things she said without meaning to surprise him. Most people mention the size first, or the location, given how far we are from anything resembling a city. "I grew up somewhere that looked impressive and felt cold," Sophia said. "I noticed the warm-looking places now." He didn't answer that, but something in his face shifted slightly, and he didn't look away from her quite as fast as he had at any point during the carriage ride. The staff lined up to greet them in the entrance hall. A dozen people in dark uniforms, human and vampire mixed, all of them studying Sophia with the careful blankness of people trained not to show curiosity even when they were dying of it. An older woman stepped forward first, silver hair pulled back tight, sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Your Majesty," she said to Roman, then turned to Sophia with a small bow. "My queen. I'm Mrs. Renner. I manage the household." "Sophia," Sophia said, then caught herself. "I mean, you can call me Sophia, if that's allowed." A ripple went through the staff, something Sophia couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. Mrs. Renner's eyebrows rose just slightly before she smoothed her expression back into something professional. "Of course, my queen," she said, in a tone that suggested it was very much not of course, that no one had ever said anything like that to her before. Roman cleared his throat. "Sophia will need chambers prepared. The East Wing, the rooms near the library. Those rooms haven't been used since Mrs. Renner stopped herself." "I'm aware," Roman said, his voice tightening just slightly. "Prepare them anyway." Sophia filed that away without asking. There would be time for questions later, she told herself, though she wasn't sure that was true. Everything about this castle felt like it was holding its breath around old grief nobody had explained to her yet. Her chambers, once she finally reached them after a walk through hallways lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors, were larger than the entire ground floor of her father's house. A canopy bed. A sitting room with its own fireplace. Windows that looked out over a garden gone slightly wild, roses climbing untended over a low stone wall. This, is too much," Sophia said to the maid who'd shown her in, a young woman named Greta, who couldn't have been older than 17. Greta blinked at her. "Too much, my queen? I don't need all this space. I grew up sharing a room with my sister until I was 12. Sophia ran her hand along the edge of a dresser carved from wood so dark it looked almost black. "Is there somewhere smaller? I wouldn't mind. I don't think anyone's ever asked for smaller before," Greta said, looking genuinely baffled. "Should I ask Mrs. Renner?" "No, it's fine. Never mind. This is fine." Sophia felt heat rise in her face, embarrassed without entirely knowing why, except that she could tell she'd said something strange again. Something that didn't match whatever picture this household had carried in their heads of what a queen was supposed to want. The first week settled into an uneasy rhythm. Roman was gone most days. Buried in council meetings Sophia wasn't invited to, and didn't ask about, returning some evenings for dinner, which they ate mostly in silence at a table long enough to seat 30 people, the two of them sitting at opposite ends like strangers, forced to share a restaurant. Sophia spent her days exploring instead, learning the castle's layout, one wing at a time. Finding the kitchen first, because it was the only room that felt familiar, full of warmth and clattering pots, and a cook named Bertrand who initially nearly dropped a tray when his queen wandered in, asking if she could help peel vegetables. "My queen, you shouldn't, that's not," Bertrand had started, flustered. "I like cooking," Sophia said simply. "My mother taught me before she died. It's the one thing I'm actually good at." Bertrand had stared at her for a long moment, then, slowly, handed her a knife and a bowl of potatoes, and something about the easy, ordinary motion of peeling vegetables next to a stranger who didn't expect anything from her except clean cuts made Sophia feel more like herself than she had in days. Word apparently traveled fast in a household this size, because by the end of the week, the staff had stopped treating her like fragile glass and started treating her like simply a person who happened to live there. Small things changed. Mrs. Renner started leaving the kitchen door unlocked for her in the mornings. Greta brought her tea without being asked, the same blend Sophia had mentioned liking once in passing. Roman noticed too, though he said nothing about it directly. Sophia caught him once, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her laugh at something Bertrand said while flour dusted both their hands, an expression on his face she couldn't quite name before he turned and walked away without a word. 3 weeks in, Sophia found the locked room. She hadn't meant to. She'd been exploring the East Wing on a rainy afternoon, restless, Roman gone to a council session that was apparently running long even by vampire standards, and she'd turned down a corridor she didn't recognize and found a door slightly different from the others. Older wood, a lock that looked like it had been added later. Not part of the original design. She didn't try the handle. She just stood there a moment, curious, before Mrs. Renner's voice came sharp from behind her. "That room is not part of your wing, my queen." Sophia turned, startled. "I wasn't going to go in. I just noticed the door looked different." Mrs. Renner's face did something complicated, softening slightly from its usual brisk efficiency. It was the late Queen's sitting room. His Majesty had it sealed after she passed. "I don't believe anyone has been inside in close to 80 years. Sophia's stomach dropped a little. "I didn't know there was a late Queen. It's not something His Majesty discusses." Mrs. Renner hesitated, then added, more gently than Sophia had heard her speak before, "She died of an illness. Human, you understand, though by the time he found her she was already vampire turned and it didn't matter in the end. He doesn't speak of it. I'd advise against asking him directly, but I thought you should know it exists, rather than stumble onto it some other way and wonder why he reacted strangely." Sophia thanked her and walked away without looking back at the door. But she carried the knowledge with her for days, turning it over, understanding a little more now about the careful distance Roman kept, the way he never quite let himself relax even in his own home. She didn't bring it up, not directly. But that evening at dinner, when the silence stretched too long the way it usually did, Sophia found herself asking, "Were you married before?" Roman's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. "Mrs. Renner told you." She didn't mean to gossip. I found the door and asked. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Sophia thought he might simply refuse to answer, might retreat behind that cool, careful expression he wore like armor. "Her name was Isabel," he said finally. "We were married for 40 years before I turned her, and another 60 after. She died of a sickness that doesn't usually kill vampires, except it did, slowly, over almost a decade, and there was nothing any physician, human or otherwise, could do about it." His voice stayed level, but his hands had gone still on the table, motionless in a way that seemed deliberate, like keeping perfectly still was the only thing holding something else in place. That was 83 years ago. "I'm sorry," Sophia said quietly. "Most people, when they learn that, ask why I never remarried in 80 years. He looked at her then, properly, the way he'd looked at her in the garden the day they met, searching for something he hadn't found yet. "You haven't asked that. I assumed the answer was obvious," Sophia said. "You didn't want to." "I didn't want to," Roman agreed, "until the council decided differently for me and arranged a marriage on paper to settle a debt with a human merchant family I'd never met." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "And then the bride I was contracted to marry sent her twin sister in her place, and somehow, that turned out to be the first time in 80 years I didn't dread coming home for dinner." Sophia felt heat climb up her neck, not entirely comfortable with how much that admission landed somewhere in her chest. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I know." His voice softened, just slightly, just enough that Sophia noticed. "That's not what this is. Isabel was Isabel. He stopped, seeming to search for the word, then gave up looking for it. "You're something else entirely. I haven't decided what yet. That's not very flattering." "It's honest," Roman said. "I find I prefer it. Lately, honesty." He picked his fork back up, the moment closing itself the way moments did with him, careful and deliberate. But something had shifted in the room. Some wall lowered an inch that hadn't been lowered before. "Tell me something true about yourself, Sophia Calloway. Something Elena wouldn't have told me if she'd stood in that garden instead of you." Sophia thought about it, turning the question over. "Elena would have told you about the things she's good at. The piano, the languages, the way she can charm a room without trying. She's not wrong to be proud of those things. She is good at them. And you?" "I used to want to be a healer," Sophia said, surprising herself with how easily it came out. A truth she hadn't said aloud in years. "Before my mother died, I used to follow the village physician around asking questions until he finally let me help mix tinctures, just to make me stop talking. My father thought it was an embarrassing hobby for a Calloway daughter. Said it wasn't dignified work for someone who might marry well someday." She shrugged, like the old hurt didn't still sit somewhere under her ribs, even though it did. "So I stopped talking about it. Eventually I stopped doing it at all." Roman was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Something that looked almost like anger, though she understood quickly it wasn't aimed at her. "That's a waste," he said quietly, "of a talent your own father should have been proud of." "It doesn't matter now. It matters," Roman said, with a quiet certainty that startled her more than anything else he'd said since the wedding. "We have a physician here, old, set in his ways, badly in need of an apprentice he's too stubborn to admit he wants. If you're still interested, I could arrange an introduction." Sophia stared at him, something unfamiliar rising in her chest, cautious and warm at once. "You'd do that?" "You're my wife," Roman said simply. "Whatever the original circumstances, I'd like the time you spend in this castle to be more than waiting out a contract." Sophia didn't have a response ready for that. For the first time since the wedding, the silence between them didn't feel uncomfortable at all. The old physician's name was Master Aldrich, and he was exactly as stubborn as Roman had promised. For the first 2 weeks of Sophia's apprenticeship, he barely spoke to her beyond barked instructions, testing her, she suspected, waiting for her to give up or faint at the sight of something unpleasant, or complain about the smell of the tincture room. She did none of those things. She showed up early, stayed late, asked questions when she didn't understand, and kept quiet when she did. And slowly, grudgingly, Aldrich started explaining things instead of just ordering her around. "You have good hands," he admitted one afternoon, watching her stitch a practice wound on a leather pad with neat, even loops. "Steady. Most apprentices shake the first dozen times." "I had practice staying steady," Sophia said, for other reasons, and didn't elaborate, and Aldrich, to his credit, didn't ask. The real test came almost 2 months into the marriage, on a night when a messenger arrived from one of the outer villages, half frantic, saying there'd been an accident at the mill, a worker pinned under a collapsed beam, bleeding badly, and the village's own healer was 3 days' travel away, tending a fever outbreak elsewhere. Aldrich was already in bed, exhausted from a long day, his joints too stiff for hard riding at night. Sophia didn't think twice. She grabbed the emergency kit they kept prepared exactly for situations like this, and was halfway to the stables before anyone thought to stop her. Roman caught up to her there, still in his evening clothes, alarm written across his usually careful face. "You can't go alone. It's 2 hours by horse in the dark, and I don't yet know if this is an accident or something else." "Someone is bleeding to death right now," Sophia said, already swinging up onto a horse with more confidence than she actually felt. "I don't have 2 hours to wait for you to decide it's safe." For 1 second, Roman looked like he might argue. Then, without another word, he mounted his own horse and rode beside her the entire way, faster than any horse should reasonably travel, fast enough that Sophia had to grip the reins white-knuckled and trust that he wouldn't let her fall. The mill was chaos when they arrived, lantern light and shouting, and a young man pinned beneath a fallen beam, his leg crushed, blood soaking through a makeshift bandage someone had pressed against the wound with shaking hands. Sophia didn't hesitate. She was on her knees in the mud beside him within seconds, calling out instructions, directing 2 of the largest men present to help lift the beam while she kept pressure on the wound, talking the injured man through his panic in a low, steady voice that didn't waver even though her hands were slick with blood and her own heart was hammering. "Stay with me," she told him, when his eyes started to roll back. "Look at me. What's your name?" "Tomas," he managed, teeth gritted. "Tomas, you're going to be fine, but you have to stay awake and look at me. Can you do that?" She worked for almost an hour, cleaning and binding the wound as best she could in the lantern light, setting the worst of the break with a confidence she didn't entirely feel but refused to let show, while Roman stood close behind her the entire time, silent, watching, occasionally handing her something from the kit before she even asked for it, like he'd memorized the order Aldrich had taught her without being told. By the time they got Tomas stabilized enough to transport back to the castle's proper medical room, the sky outside had started turning gray at the edges. Sophia sat back on her heels in the mud, suddenly aware of how badly her hands were shaking now that the emergency had passed, now that there was nothing left to do but feel the aftermath of it. Roman crouched down in front of her, careful, the way he might approach something fragile. "You saved his leg," he said quietly. "Possibly his life. I don't know that yet." "I do." He reached out, hesitated for half a second, then gently took one of her shaking hands in both of his, turning it over to look at the dried blood streaked across her knuckles. "I've watched physicians with 40 years of training freeze under less pressure than what you just handled without flinching. I was terrified the entire time." "That's not the same as freezing," Roman said. "You were terrified, and you worked anyway. That's something else entirely. That's courage, Sophia, whether or not it felt like it from inside. Something about the way he said her name, low and certain, made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She looked up at him, and he was closer than she'd realized. Close enough that she could see flecks of gray in his eyes she'd never noticed before. Close enough that for one long, suspended second, neither of them moved. Then, a horse whinnied somewhere behind them, one of the village men calling out that the cart was ready to transport Tomas, and the moment broke apart as quickly as it had formed. Roman stood first, offering his hand to pull her up, and if his fingers lingered around hers a half-second longer than strictly necessary, neither of them mentioned it on the long ride home. But something had changed between them in that mud-soaked hour, something neither of them had words for yet, and Sophia found herself thinking about the particular way he'd said her name for the rest of the ride, all the way back through the gray, breaking dawn. Elena showed up at the castle gates 4 months after the wedding, soaked from rain, traveling alone, with no warning and no escort, and it took Sophia a full 10 seconds of staring at the guard's confused report to understand what she was hearing. A woman at the gate, the guard had said, claiming to be the Queen's sister. She looks, he'd hesitated, clearly unsettled. She looks exactly like you, my queen. Sophia met her in one of the smaller sitting rooms, heart pounding, 4 months of unanswered questions rising up all at once. Elena looked thinner than Sophia remembered, her traveling clothes plain and road-worn. Nothing like the silk she'd been wearing the last time Sophia had seen her face, half hidden behind a row of roses, watching her own wedding happen to someone else. "You're alive," Sophia said, which wasn't what she meant to say first, but it came out anyway. Relief and anger tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. "Sophia," Elena's voice cracked. She crossed the room fast and pulled Sophia into a hug that Sophia, after a stiff second, returned. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have come back sooner. I should have explained everything to him myself instead of leaving you to where have you been." Sophia pulled back, studying her sister's face for answers. 4 months, Elena. I didn't know if you were alive. Dad told everyone you'd gone to stay with an aunt in the south for your health, and I had no way to know if that was true, or if he was just covering for the fact that he didn't know either. Elena's eyes filled. I was scared. I kept telling myself I'd come back the next week, then the next, and every week that passed made it harder to face what I'd done. I left you to deal with all of it. The wedding, the marriage, a vampire king who probably hates me for what I did. She sank into a chair, looking smaller than Sophia had ever seen her. I was staying with someone. Daniel. He works the stables back home. He always has. You remember him. Sophia did remember him. A quiet, kind young man who'd never once treated either Calloway twin like they were anything other than ordinary people. You ran off with Daniel. I love him, Alana said simply. I have for years, and I never told anyone because Dad would have never allowed it. A stable hand isn't exactly the match he had planned for either of us. When the marriage contract came through, marrying a vampire king I'd never met felt like the final nail. I panicked. I'm not proud of how I handled it, but I panicked, and you were the one who paid for it. I didn't pay for it, Sophia said slowly, surprising herself with how true it felt to say out loud. Not the way you think. It's been hard and strange, and I didn't choose any of this. But Elena, I'm not unhappy. Not anymore. Not the way I thought I'd be. Elena studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. You care about him. Sophia didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. Sophia, Elena's voice went careful. You know this isn't real, don't you? Whatever's happening with you and him, it started as a contract because of Dad's debts. It's not some grand love story just because he's been kind to you. The words landed harder than Sophia expected, an old fear she hadn't let herself examine too closely, suddenly given shape and voice by the one person who knew her best. "I know what it started as," Sophia said quietly. "I just don't want you to get hurt," Elena said. "I know how you are. You give everything to people who don't always." She stopped herself, but Sophia heard the rest of the sentence anyway. The old accusation underneath it, the one about their father, about a lifetime of giving Elena everything and getting scraps in return. Before Sophia could respond, the door opened, and Roman stepped inside, clearly having been told about the unexpected guest. His eyes moved between the two identical faces, something unreadable passing across his expression. "Elena Calloway," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I wondered if we'd meet eventually." Elena stood, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been with Sophia. "Your Majesty, I owe you an apology. A significant one. What I did at the wedding was—" "We'll discuss it," Roman said. Not unkindly, but firmly. "Privately, later for now. You're welcome to stay as a guest while we sort out the appropriate response." Elena nodded, looking relieved at the reprieve, and excused herself to find the room Mrs. Renner had been sent to prepare, leaving Sophia and Roman alone in the sitting room, with the rain still falling steady against the windows. "How much did you hear?" Sophia asked. "Enough," Roman said. His expression had gone careful again, the mask Sophia had learned to recognize, the one he wore when he was working through something complicated. "Sophia, there's something you should know. While you were apprenticing with Aldrich this past month, a member of my council, Lord Dreven, requested an unusual amount of information about your family history. I assumed it was routine curiosity about my new queen. I no longer think it was routine." Sophia's stomach dropped. "You think he knows? About the switch?" "I think," Roman said grimly, "that with your sister now sitting in a guest room down the hall looking exactly like you, the chance of this staying quiet just dropped considerably. And Lord Dreven has wanted my throne for longer than you've been alive. If he finds proof that our marriage began as fraud against a treaty, he won't need to fight me for it. He'll simply have the council strip it from me, legally, cleanly, with the entire court's blessing." The rain kept falling outside, steady and indifferent, while somewhere down the hall, Elena unpacked a bag in a guest room, unaware that her arrival might have just handed their enemies exactly the weapon they'd been waiting 4 months to find. Lord Dreven made his move 3 days later, at a council session Sophia had never been invited to before, and was suddenly, pointedly, summoned to attend. The council chamber was colder than the rest of the castle, all dark stone and high windows. A long table surrounded by faces Sophia mostly didn't recognize, vampire lords and ladies who'd ruled territories for centuries, watching her walk in with the same careful, assessing stares she remembered from her wedding day. Elena sat near the back, pale and uneasy, having been summoned as well, clearly unsure why. Lord Dreven stood as soon as Roman took his seat at the head of the table. He was an older vampire, silver-haired, with the kind of polished smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Your Majesty," he began, "I have information that affects the legitimacy of your marriage, and by extension, the validity of the treaty it was meant to settle." Roman's expression didn't change. "Then, share it, Lord Dreven. The council is listening. I have testimony," Dreven continued, clearly enjoying himself, "from members of the Calloway household staff, confirming that the woman who walked down the aisle 8 months ago was not the bride named in the original contract. That woman," he gestured toward the back of the room, toward Elena, whose face had gone bone white, "is sitting among us today. An imposter switch, executed in front of 300 witnesses, deceiving this entire court." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the room. Sophia kept her chin up, refusing to let her hands shake the way they wanted to, even as every eye in the chamber turned toward her. "If this is true," Dreven pressed on, voice rising with theatrical outrage, Then the marriage was fraudulent from its very first moment. The treaty it secured should be considered void. And frankly, Your Majesty, the council should question whether a king who either knew about this deception and concealed it, or failed entirely to notice it, is fit to continue. I knew, Roman said. The room went silent. I knew within seconds. Roman continued, standing now, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly still chamber. I knew the moment I took her hand at the altar that the woman standing in front of me was not the bride described in my contract. I completed the ceremony anyway, because I made a judgment in that moment about what would actually serve this court and its people. Dreven's smug expression faltered slightly. You admit to deliberately concealing a fraud from this council? I admit to making a decision a king is entitled to make, Roman said. The Callaway Treaty exists to protect trade routes and stabilize debt this court is owed. Nothing about that purpose required the specific identity of the bride. I assessed the situation and determined the marriage still served its function. His eyes moved to Sophia, something steady and certain in them that she felt in her chest like a physical thing. What I did not anticipate, Lord Dreven, was that the woman who actually stood at that altar would prove herself, repeatedly, over 8 months, to be more capable, more honest, and more genuinely suited to this court than the original arrangement ever could have produced. Sentiment, Dreven spat, is not law. No, Roman agreed. But neither is your outrage, Lord Dreven, and I notice you've conveniently left out the part where you spent the last month digging through a human merchant family's private staff for information that serves no purpose except destabilizing my throne. His voice sharpened, dangerous now in a way Sophia hadn't heard from him before. This isn't concern for treaty law. This is opportunity, and you've been waiting for one since the day I took this seat. Several council members shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Dreven and Roman like they were recalculating something. The woman in question, Roman continued, turning to address the full table now, has served this court honorably since the day she arrived. She has treated our staff with respect they're rarely shown by nobility. She rode into a crisis at the outer mill without hesitation and saved a man's life with her own hands. She has earned the trust of this household in 8 months more thoroughly than some members of this council have earned mine in 80 years. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, quieter, but somehow louder for it. I am not asking this council's permission to remain married to her. I am informing you of the fact. Sophia Callaway is my queen by choice mine, made with full knowledge of how the marriage began. If anyone at this table believes that disqualifies her, I invite them to bring a formal challenge, and we will settle the matter the old way. The way this court has always settled disputes of legitimacy. Nobody at the table moved. Dreven's jaw tightened, calculating, clearly weighing the cost of pushing further against a king who just openly offered combat as an alternative to debate. After a long, tense silence, he sat back down, defeated for now, though the look he gave Sophia on his way down promised this wasn't finished. The council head cleared his throat, visibly relieved to move past the confrontation. The treaty stands then, as does the marriage. Are there other matters to bring before this session? There weren't. The meeting dissolved into stiff, awkward conversation, and Sophia found herself moving through the dispersing crowd in something like a daze, Roman's hand finding the small of her back the way it had at the wedding reception, except this time, it didn't feel like containment. It felt like he simply didn't want to stop touching her. That night, Sophia found Roman on the balcony outside his study, looking out over the dark garden below. The same garden she'd glimpsed from her window her first week in the castle, roses still climbing wild and untended over the low stone wall. You didn't have to say all that, she said, joining him at the railing. In there. You could have let the council think whatever they wanted about why the marriage stayed intact. Politics, treaty obligations. You didn't have to make it about she gestured vaguely between them, unable to find the right word. About what it actually is? Roman finished, glancing at her sideways. I don't know what it actually is, Sophia admitted. Do you? He was quiet for a long moment, his hands braced on the stone railing, the city lights of the territory spread out far below them, scattered and small. I know that 80 years ago I told myself I'd never feel anything again that mattered enough to risk losing. I know that for 80 years, that worked. Nothing got close enough to threaten the wall I'd built. He turned to face her fully. And I know that 8 months ago, a woman in the wrong wedding dress looked at me in a garden and ruined that wall completely, without even trying to. Sophia's breath caught. Roman let me finish, because I don't say things like this easily, and if I stop now, I might not start again. His voice was low, steady despite the obvious effort it cost him. I watched you ride into a crisis without hesitation. I watched you treat a frightened kitchen boy with the same respect you give visiting dignitaries. I watched you stand in front of a council of people who could destroy your family and refuse to apologize for existing in the life you'd been handed. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. I didn't marry you, Sophia. Not really. Not the version of events anyone in that chamber believes. I married a stranger out of obligation, and somewhere in the month since, I fell in love with the actual woman standing in front of me instead. I thought you'd never say something like that. Sophia whispered. I thought I'd never feel something like that again, Roman said. And yet, she closed the distance between them before he could say anything else, and the kiss that followed was nothing like the careful, business-like distance they'd kept for 8 months. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, hers fisted in the front of his shirt, and when they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Sophia found herself laughing. A real laugh, surprised out of her by the sheer strangeness of how her life had unfolded since that morning on the bathroom floor, holding her sister's hair back. What? Roman asked, smiling. An actual smile, the first one she'd seen from him without effort behind it. Nothing, just thinking about how angry I was at Elena 4 hours after my wedding for ruining my entire life, Sophia said, and now I don't know how to thank her for it. Elena, as it turned out, didn't need thanking so much as forgiving, and Sophia found her the next morning in the garden, sitting on the low stone wall, looking smaller and more uncertain than Sophia had ever seen her sister look. I heard what happened in the council chamber, Elena said, not looking up. Mrs. Renner told me. I'm glad it worked out. I really am, even if some ugly, jealous part of me didn't expect it to. Were you jealous? Sophia asked, sitting beside her. A little, Elena admitted. Not because I wanted him. I loved Daniel. That part was always true. But you found something real out of a situation I created out of panic and selfishness. And some small, embarrassing part of me wondered why good things always seem to find you eventually, even when life starts out unfair to you specifically. She finally looked up, eyes wet. I'm sorry, Sophia, for this, and for every time before this, for letting you be the spare so I could be the favorite, and never once telling Dad to stop. It was the apology Sophia had waited her whole life to hear, and now that it had finally arrived, she found she didn't need it the way she once thought she would. I forgive you, Sophia said, and meant it. But Elena, I need you to actually mean it going forward. Not just today, in a garden, when you're scared and things feel raw. I need you to actually see me, the way you're seeing me right now, even after we both go back to our regular lives. I will, Elena said. I promise. Roman, it turned out, had already arranged for Daniel to be sent for, and had quietly informed Edmund Calloway that his younger daughter's marriage to a stable hand would be happening with full court backing whether he approved or not, a piece of news that arrived at the Calloway estate with enough royal weight behind it that Edmund found himself, for the first time in either daughter's life, with no real say in the matter at all. Elena and Daniel married 3 months later, in a small ceremony in the same garden where Elena had once panicked her way into changing 2 lives forever, this time with the right sister standing exactly where she belonged. 3 years after the wedding that wasn't supposed to be hers, Sophia stood in the same garden where it all started, watching her husband chase their 2-year-old daughter across the grass, while the late afternoon sun turned everything gold. The little girl, Mira, had Roman's pale eyes and Sophia's stubborn chin, and she shrieked with laughter every time her father caught her, scooping her up onto his shoulders like she weighed nothing at all. It was strange, still sometimes, to watch the king of the Eastern Court, a man 300 years old who'd once kept his entire life locked behind careful stillness, fall apart so completely and so willingly for a toddler who fed him mud pies and called them dinner. "She's going to be impossible," Mrs. Renner said, coming to stand beside Sophia with a tray of tea she hadn't asked for, but was grateful for anyway, the steam curling up into the warm evening air. The older woman had softened considerably over the years, though she'd never admit it directly. Spoiled rotten, that one. He can't say no to her about anything. He's making up for 80 years of not letting himself want anything, Sophia said, watching Roman set Mira down so she could chase a butterfly through the roses, the same wild roses that had been climbing untended over that low stone wall the first week Sophia arrived. They'd left them that way, on purpose. Roman said he liked that they grew however they wanted, no one trimming them into something more proper. Sophia had become the castle's primary healer 2 years ago, after Aldrich finally retired, gray and stubborn to the last, telling anyone who'd listen that his apprentice had surpassed him faster than any student he'd trained in 40 years of practice. She still kept her hands busy most mornings in the small clinic she'd built in the East Wing, treating villagers and staff alike, and some afternoons, if Roman's schedule allowed it, he came to sit with her there, reading reports while she worked, neither of them needing to fill the silence with conversation anymore. Elena visited twice a year, always with Daniel, sometimes with their own son now, a quiet, serious boy named after their mother. The sisters had built something steadier between them in the years since the wedding. Not perfect, never quite erasing the old imbalance entirely, but honest in a way it hadn't been before. Elena had stopped apologizing eventually, the way Sophia had asked her to, and started simply showing up instead, which turned out to matter more than the apologies ever had. Their father had died 18 months ago, quietly, of an illness that had nothing dramatic about it, and Sophia had gone to the funeral and felt mostly a complicated grief for the relationship they'd never had, rather than the one that actually existed. Roman had stood beside her through the whole thing, silent and steady, and afterward, on the long ride home, he'd simply held her hand and let her cry, without asking her to explain any of it. Lord Dreven was gone from the council now too, quietly removed after a second, far less subtle attempt to undermine the throne the following year, one that several council members had been all too happy to help expose once they'd watched Sophia prove herself, season after season, exactly the kind of queen worth protecting. Nobody questioned her place at that table anymore. Some of the oldest, most stubborn lords had even started seeking her opinion directly on matters involving the human territories, trusting her perspective in a way they'd never extended to any vampire-born queen before her. Mama. Mira came barreling across the grass, breathless, a fistful of crushed roses clutched in one small hand. "Look what I got you." Sophia crouched down to accept the offering, smashed petals and all. "They're beautiful, sweetheart, thank you. Daddy says I'm not supposed to pick the roses." Mira's pale eyes, so much like her father's, went wide and solemn. "But I picked them anyway, because you like them." Mira, Roman's voice carried across the garden, equal parts exasperated and helplessly fond, the tone of a man who'd long since lost every battle of will he'd ever fought against his daughter. "It's fine," Sophia said, laughing, pulling Mira into a hug despite the crushed flowers staining both their hands green. "We have plenty of roses." That evening, After Mira had finally been wrestled into bed, exhausted from an entire afternoon of running, Sophia found Roman on the same balcony where he'd told her 3 years ago that he loved her, looking out over a garden that had grown wilder and more beautiful every year since. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Sophia asked, joining him at the railing, the one where Elena handed me her dress and told me to hurry. "Often," Roman admitted. "Mostly I think about how close I came to making a different choice. I could have stopped the ceremony the moment I realized. Why didn't you?" At the time, I told myself it was strategy, protecting the treaty. He glanced at her, something soft and certain in his expression, even after 3 years, the kind of look that still made Sophia's chest tighten every time she caught it. "I've had 3 years to be honest with myself about the real reason. You looked at me in that garden like you were terrified, and brave, and entirely unwilling to back down even though you had every reason to run. I think some part of me decided, in that exact second, that I wasn't letting that particular woman walk back out of my life, no matter whose name was actually on the contract." Sophia leaned into his side, his arm coming around her automatically, the way it had 1,000 times since that first hesitant kiss on this same balcony. "Best mistake either of us ever made," she said. "It wasn't a mistake," Roman corrected, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It was the first honest thing that happened that entire day. You were just trying to help your sister, and ended up telling the truth about everything else by accident." Below them, the roses grew wild and untamed over the low stone wall, untrimmed and uncontained, exactly the way they liked them, and somewhere inside the castle, their daughter slept soundly in a bed she'd refused to let anyone make properly, certain in the particular fearless way of children, raised entirely without doubt that she belonged exactly where she was. Sophia had spent the first 22 years of her life believing she was the spare, the substitute, the version of someone else that nobody had actually chosen. It had taken one panicked morning, one borrowed wedding dress, and one vampire king who noticed the difference within seconds to teach her otherwise. She hadn't been a substitute at all. She'd simply been waiting for someone to look closely enough to see her. And he had, from the very first second, in a garden full of people who never noticed anything at all. Not the crown, not the castle, not even the title she'd never asked for. Just a man who'd taken her hand at an altar and known, instantly, that something precious was standing in front of him, worth keeping no matter whose name had been written on the contract.